Welcome back to the fourth episode of Too Real a Talk. Once again, my name is Kelsey Jean-Baptiste. I would just like to thank everyone who supported me along this journey. I urge for people to continue to like, share, support, and also send along suggestions for future episodes. But first, let's quickly get into this disclaimer. Any views or opinions represented or expressed here do not necessarily reflect the position of Too Real a Talk. Any content provided by guests are of their opinions and are not intended to malign any religion, ethnic group, club, organization, company, or individual. On this episode of Too Real a Talk, I had the pleasure to speak about white privilege with Scott Plate, freelance actor, director, and coach, and former department chair of theater and dance at Baldwin Wallace University. Let's take a look. What is your understanding of the current Black Lives Matter movement?
It means that I have the right to breathe. That's it. I have the right to be here and breathe the same as you. And it's very easy to fall into the head game, ego game of ideological differences. And okay, well, this means this and this means that, and this law was written this way. That is all, my grandmother used to say, the devil's confusion. That is all meant to distract us from the issue that the fundamental right to breathe is common to everyone. Breathe freely. We have learned the hard way how not to do that and how not to allow other people to do that. Black Lives Matter, to me, means that we need to be aware of the ways in which layer after layer after layer of often invisible institutional racism creates a culture where people's lives, people of color's lives, is literally worth less. So there was evidence of this hundreds of years ago, and the more subtle ways this is playing out in today's culture, for someone to call attention with big neon exclamation points to a system that has existed for hundreds and hundreds of years. So what we're trying to say, or we, if I can even use that word, or what people are trying to say with Black Lives Matter is, we belong as much as you do, and this is why this isn't true right now. So brought it to people's attention initially was video evidence, digital phone video evidence of police brutality that had existed for centuries.
So during this movement and other movements of the past, civil rights leaders and advocates think that systemic racism has created or maintained and exhibited issues of conscious and unconscious prejudice against groups and individuals that reinforce racial inequity. Do you agree with this statement? If so, how do you think history has allowed for privileges associated with whiteness?
Without going into a huge long history lesson, which you know as well as everybody else listening probably will know, but we're going back to 400 years ago when Black people were forcibly enslaved and brought to this country. Thinking about 250 years of attitudes and systems, not to mention the fact that our government was created, the systems by which we operate, laws, guiding principles created by white men, many of whom actually owned slaves. Fast forward a little bit past that Roger B. Taney Supreme Court decision to the time when slaves were freed with the Emancipation Proclamation, but could not vote nor own property. Then Jim Crow, right? We go through that entire era. And what happens is broad that came from slavery days begins to go away, and the more fine-grained, subtle kind of sinews of it begin to become apparent. So moving forward to the 20th century, you've got all kinds of evidence of taking, you finally, okay, fine, let's move forward. You can vote, you can own property, but you can't borrow money, and properties are always worth less. So even if you could borrow money, you can't really borrow against the full equity of your house. So without that economic enfranchisement, you don't have access to health care, you don't have access to education, you don't have access to advantages that would create a kind of sense of wholeness in you. And alongside this, these white people for whom these systems are created have generation after generation after generation after generation of advantages of getting ahead. So history will not be kind when we look back on the layers in which this has happened. But I'm saying things that people probably already know, but it goes back hundreds and hundreds of years. I think in many ways it's difficult for white people, first of all, to use the words white people. I don't think a lot of white people generally tend to say those words, because the hard part for us is, because we have been the benefit of generations and generations of systems that have been created to make sure that we flourish, tend to think of ourselves not as part of a picture, but as the picture. We're the paradigm against which everything else is measured. So the word diversity is a little misleading, because it means that anything other than white is diverse. So which assumes that white is the kind of the big centerpiece in the middle of the table, and everything else is compared against that or to that. And I think there's a problem with that kind of thinking, but that is what I think creates tension for white people in trying to own what is being put forth on the table as the idea of white privilege. And I think we may get to that later in the conversation, but I don't think white people have a lot of practice looking at ourselves as part of a whole. We look at ourselves as a whole. We don't even look at ourselves as a color. We look at ourselves as a majority. And I think there's a thinking that comes along with that that makes it really difficult to share space.
So based off of what you just said, what is your definition of white privilege, and why do you think there is such a lack of understanding surrounding the topic?
Again, really rich question. White privilege basically is, first of all, a 400-year head start. Understanding that I will never have to worry about my worth or value in American society because of the color of my skin. Because the systems that have been created basically sustain me, and they promote me, and they put me first. Does it mean that I haven't struggled? No. Does it mean that I'm responsible for all the sins of my ancestors? No. Does it mean that I should make an effort to educate myself and be aware of the fact that the institutions that have been created were created by people who looked like me to protect people who looked like me, and that I should live my life trying to level the playing field? Yes. So again, getting back to Echo's question, what's in it for me? My soul. What's in it for me is my salvation as a human being, right? My actual right to call myself a human being who actually values human life. I need to spend time with this, and I need to face loss with this. I need to acknowledge what I have gained at someone else's expense with this, and be okay enough to live in my discomfort long enough so that someone else can trust me. Me personally, the reason why it's uncomfortable is it feels like being given credit for something you didn't do. It feels like, oh yeah, you're white, so gender, I don't get points for being male. I don't get points for being white. I shouldn't get points for being white, but in this culture I do, right? So I think the problem is that it feels hollow to me to speak from my point of view, because it feels as though I've been standing in front of a race of people who's been forced to prove their worth over and over and over and over again, and succeed in spite of every kind of conceivable obstacle that our institutional layers of racism could throw. And what have I got to offer that compares to that? It's like, okay, I haven't bled I watched you bleed, but what did I do? What did I give of myself? What cost me? And I think sometimes and again, I'm speaking from my own experience. I can't say that all white people would feel this way, but I think sometimes there's an insecurity in me that I haven't fought hard enough. And so I guess the fight has to happen here. And then when it feels like it's formed enough to share it with the space, I can.
So for someone, this is obviously a sensitive topic, but it's existing. It's happening right now. Yeah. And in your opinion, what are some questions that Americans should have about racial equality?
Some questions that we should carry, for sure, are, okay, am I doing everything I can to understand this situation? The very first sentence in the Constitution, in the preamble, talks about for the common welfare. The whole purpose of the document was to promote the good of all. So until we can educate ourselves beyond our own silo, carry the question of what am I doing with my life right now that actually includes people whose experiences are not my own? Can I stretch myself beyond the silo that, first of all, my virtual online world reinforces? My experience, my culture, my family, my choices, whatever. Can I think beyond? Toni Morrison, one of my literary heroes, used to teach at Princeton for years and years. And she taught writing. And the first thing she said to her students was, I wish I had her as a teacher. Everyone says to writers, write what you know. She would say, oh, no, no, no. Write what you don't know. Start by writing about what you don't know, because if you actually can imagine your way into another human life, you have the capacity to engender empathy. And empathy is not sympathy. Empathy is being able to mentally enter into the feelings and experience of another human being and find interest there. So that's a question we could carry. Do I have empathy for people? And can I actually see myself as gaining by that? Paying attention, I think, feels like it costs people. What do I gain when I pay with my attention? I gain my own attention. I gain something in myself, a magnetic center of gravity that tends to draw the experiences I need to me. But I genuinely have to have an interest. Otherwise, I'm just commenting online.
And so, based on your personal experience, which you touched on, what are
Mhm.
some self-reflections you've had, that this movement has, about the movement, that the movement has made you start to think about?
What makes me uncomfortable? And let's go there. When I say uncomfortable, I mean, it's like I'm engaging in a study of an Enneagram system, which is really interesting. It's like personality types and things like that. But the part where you start to grow, your growth edge, is where you see behavior that is you, and you kind of go, "Ugh, my God, that is so me." It's in that system is what they call a trajectory of consciousness. You are moving through a series of layers of, I'm in my destructive phase of this type, I'm in the controlling phase of this type, or I've transcended the suffering into the creative phase. But you have to take on a certain degree of necessary suffering in order to achieve the perspective that comes from the fact that suffering ultimately is optional. But I have to kind of learn by feeling uncomfortable that it's actually possible to survive with that. I remember the first time I saw, this was Philando Castile in his car and his girlfriend taking the picture of it. And I thought to myself, this is the only justice that exists here. If someone steps forward and tells this story, it's going to get twisted out of shape to fit the narrative that people need to be true. It was interesting when Me Too broke and Harvey Weinstein, the first person I thought about was Anita Hill, strangely enough, because she's like the godmother of all of this from back in 1993. So 27 years later, people call her up and say, hey, what do you think? And she's like, people subscribe to narratives that they need to believe are true, that fit their worldview. They don't want the needle out of that narrative so far that it makes their worldview and their narrative untrue.
Is there anything that you would like to add that I may have forgotten to mention or forgotten to bring up, or just anything to add in general?
Anyone who might be struggling with the issue of what privilege is, don't assume you know what it is. Don't assume you understand what it is. Don't subscribe to the label and how it makes you feel. Look at the evidence, look at the facts, look at how they square with your own life, and then begin to make informed choices that include not just you, but everybody else, because we are, after all, breathing the same air. We are all breathing in this place. So is the air, I don't want to thought about George Floyd and not having any air.
Yeah.
I didn't expect that.
Yeah.
But just give people some freaking air is all I'm trying to say. Just make sure everyone has the same air you have. And that means space, it means sovereignty, it means agency. If I occupy space, the person next to me is also occupying space. And it means they have to have the same ability to be alive. That's it. It's all it really boils down to. And if you're breathing and you're struggling, you immediately have empathy for doing the same thing. I can't watch that video. I can't watch it. I cannot watch it. It's too hard. So I saw it. I can't go back to it. I can't watch it again. I don't have that need to pick that scab, but I felt it like, ugh. So I don't know whether that adds anything to the conversation, but just let people breathe. That's all I can say. Let people breathe free.
Once again, thank you, Scott. On the next episode of Too Real to Talk, we'll be speaking with a special guest about the role of the police system within our society. Stay tuned.